his patient, Mademoiselle, is claiming that she isn't alive. For an example, one may believe they're being followed around their house when no one is there, with a memory impairment and some difficulty understanding people speaking her same language. After recovering, he was found to have been shattered into 10 different versions of himself. It affects nearly 6.7 million Americans, and there is about a 10% chance you will develop some form of it as you get older. I think the reason psychological horror gets to me so much nowadays is because of the severe mental effects that it portrays either on the victims or on the people watching. But what most people don't realize is how serious and disturbing the mental disorders that actually exist in real life can become for those who are affected by them. Mental illness is a huge problem for so many people, and there are even more that don't realize how life-altering some of these diagnoses are. Now, with this in mind, I wanted to make this video sort of bringing attention to the lesser-known, rare, but yet equally devastating mental disorders and some of their symptoms that make it that much harder for people to deal with. Some of these might be familiar to you, and others might be completely foreign. Now, before we dive in, I do want to clarify that I am not a mental health professional by any means, but I am committed to extensive research on this topic. But please remember that I'm only as reliable as my sources, which may not always be correct. Therefore, take the information in this video with a grain of salt. And despite the serious nature of these disorders, I want to emphasize that there is always hope for treatment. People close to me have been diagnosed with some of these, and I cannot emphasize enough that professional help has made a huge difference in their lives. So please, for the sake of you or maybe those around you, don't hesitate to seek help. With that being said, I'll be providing some links down below for anyone who wants them. Now, if there's one mental illness that I think most people are familiar with, it is major depressive disorder or clinical depression. Major depressive disorder or depression leads all the way back to 400 BC, where they would refer to it as melancholia. But despite it being so long ago, they still kind of figured that it had something to do with the imbalance of bodily fluids that they called humors. However, the modern adaptation of understanding what depression really is was done by the psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who identified the feelings of depression along with feelings of mania, which is something I will be going over when we talk about bipolar disorder. The exact first case was not documented, but eventually this would lead to the medications that we have today. Depression, while being a common mental disorder, is just as dangerous as any of the other ones that I'm talking about today, as it can easily control someone's entire life, changing how they think about themselves as well as the world around them, and enveloping their entire environment in darkness. Since depression is theorized to be caused by the receptors in your brain not being able to properly hold on to positive emotions like serotonin and dopamine, people with major depressive disorder often are just left feeling empty, or even worse, just with the negative emotions. Major depressive disorder can be chronic, and since it affects how you think, you don't really think help is possible, and in some severe cases, not even worth it. I cannot emphasize enough that if someone you know or yourself is diagnosed with this, do not take it lightly. It never hurts to check in on people every once in a while and make sure they're doing okay. And even though it does seem hopeless at times, and this goes with all of the disorders that I'm going over today, I don't think there is such a thing as untreatable depression. Since it has been around for so long, there are just so many different treatments that they could try. Eventually, one will help, especially when paired with different types of psychotherapy. A lot of people close to me have seen a lot of success in improving their lives with this. It is dangerous to ignore major depressive disorder, as it is often fatal due to thoughts of self-harm, and in serious cases, even worse. So if someone reaches out to you, don't take it lightly, even if it's just to talk, because you help them more than you know. In case you have seen my video about surrealism, you know that I have previously used a format similar to the Uncanny Valley, which I, for that specific video, called the liminal uncanny valley. As I was doing research for this video, I decided that I wanted to investigate the connection between the rarity of each of these conditions and the general impact it has on the lives of those affected by each disorder. Now, I want to let you guys know that I'll be trying my best to make the metrics on this graph completely unopinionated and using only the official statistics for each disorder. Despite how it may look, I think it's important to not treat this specific one as a rating system, because Unlike my other videos, that's not what the point of this is. I like to think of it simply as a method to group them together in order to better understand what we're looking at. For example, the common disorders on this list can be just as bad as the rare disorders on this list, and even the conditions on the more manageable side of the valley are still considered incredibly life-damaging and are incredibly hard to deal with, and should be treated with the same respect as the other side. For the purpose of this video, right now we are discussing the common disorders that affect a bigger variety of people. But as we move forward, we will dive into the more rare disorders that are grouped at the bottom of the valley, seeing far fewer diagnoses on average per year. Despite being one of the more commonly heard of disorders, bipolar is somewhat of a more complicated mental illness than people originally thought. As I mentioned before, bipolar, similar to depression, was discovered by ancient peoples, with the first cases dating back to Hippocrates circa 460 to 370 BC, recognizing its highs and lows and how they could easily shift. But the term itself, bipolar, was not used until about the mid-1900s. It was around then that it was categorized as its own unique illness that was more focused on two dominating moods, being the high energy mania mood and the depressive lows. Now, I think you'll notice that I use the word intense energy rather than happy, because it's not always what you would call happy. It just means incredibly energetic, and that does not always mean it is good energy, as more often than not, mania can cause intense anger and impulsive behavior, which includes violent and dangerous actions, and in some cases, almost feeling invincible at times, which is not the best for obvious reasons. This is countered by the other side of the aisle, depressive episodes, which more often than not consist of feelings of sadness and emptiness, under or oversleeping, feelings of worthlessness, and of course, thoughts of self-harm. Between these two behaviors, bipolar individuals can have extremely unstable moments, which can often lead to hospitalization. Bipolar is typically treated with mood-stabling medicines as well as extensive amounts of therapy. Having a mood-related illness like this is often detrimental to someone's life, so these can make a huge difference, especially in aspects of maintaining jobs and relationships with the people around you. Bipolar affects about 2.8% of the US population, and the mood swings can get severe and cause significant disruptions to everyday life. And while it can be stabilized, it is often always possible that there could be a relapse, especially if you miss taking your meds. Next, I want to go over one of the more extreme symptoms that people can experience with some of these disorders, known by most people as psychosis. Psychosis is going to be something that I'm going to be mentioning probably multiple times throughout this video, as it does pertain to a lot of these disorders, not to mention it is one of the scariest symptoms to me. For those unaware, psychosis is a state in which the brain is so thrown off due to either mental conditions or in some cases a large dose of certain drugs, particularly hallucinogens. It can be defined in the simplest sense as severe delusions. For an example, one may believe they're being followed around their house when no one is there. Someone may believe someone is staring at them or laughing at them because of their behavior, when in reality the person doesn't even notice them. In severe instances, they may see a shadow figure stalking them just out of sight. They may panic, and if someone asks if they are okay, they may be speaking a different language or gibberish in the perspective of the person. It may also manifest in the form of paranoia, and people may believe that they have been targeted in some sort of grand conspiracy or that someone is out to get them. Anyone who has had a bad trip or a green out sort of knows what it feels like. And I'm not going to explain that to you. If you know, you know. Regardless, certain episodes last anywhere from hours to even months. It feels almost like a separation from what's real and what's fake. For anyone who thinks they might be experiencing a severe episode of psychosis, I suggest finding somebody that you trust to come and look over you to make sure you don't hurt yourself or that you can make it through okay. But if this is not an option, then one can start to use grounding techniques as a method of bringing themselves back to reality. Some of these include deep breathing, holding a familiar or precious object to you, or focusing on your senses and identifying 5 things you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. I by no means, however, am a psychologist or a psychiatrist of any kind, so again, please take this and every form of advice that I'm giving in this video with a grain of salt, and if you notice frequent episodes, please seek help from somebody who is experienced in this field. The chances of having an episode of psychosis is about 3% in your lifetime, which means it fits into the common disorder category. But keep in mind, it is a symptom that can come from many disorders, so I'm going to place it off to the side coincide with the other symptoms that I'm going to be going over today. Now, thus far, we have gone over mostly disorders that affect your life and how you function, but this disorder is a fairly well-known one that more affects the people around you and the ones you interact with. I'm of course referring to antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD for short. Antisocial personality disorder causes one to lose touch with what is right and wrong, as well as finding satisfaction in lying and manipulating everyone around them in order to get what they want, which is often not good things. They tend to be impulsive and lack the means to take responsibility, along with any sense of remorse. If this disorder seems familiar to you, it's because it is the umbrella term that both psychopaths and sociopaths fall under. Since a lot of times ASPD includes aggression and disregard for social norms, a lot of criminals, including killers like these two men as examples, have been suspected of having this disorder, along with people like them. Exact causes of ASPD are unknown. It is often suspected that childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect may contribute to it, but it is in no way an excuse for the crimes that are committed by these people. Many people who have this disorder don't want treatment as they don't see what they're doing as wrong, which ends up being tragic because people around them end up losing their lives. The ones who do seek help before committing heinous acts could benefit from therapy, meds, and rehabilitation clinics meant for ASPD. Before I move on, I want to go quickly over the differences between psychopaths and sociopaths, as they're often kind of mixed up and used interchangeably. When it comes to psychopaths, it definitely is considered more severe and has a complete lack of emotion or emotional attachment, even though it might seem like they don't have that. They are incredibly smart, and they possess the ability to plan things as well as fake emotions, and as a way to blend in and get you to trust them, which is why so many of the criminals I talked about earlier tend to get away with what they're doing for longer than they should. Sociopaths, on the other hand, may form emotional bonds, but it's still very limited. They are more leaning towards in-the-moment impulsive outbursts of rage or other strong emotions. Unlike psychopaths, sociopaths struggle fitting in and mimicking typical emotions. ASPD affects up to 4% of the population, but as I mentioned, it is more life-altering for the people around you than the person themselves. And a lot of the times, the people affected by this don't even realize something is wrong, especially with psychopaths. I just want to claim that not everyone with ASPD is dangerous. I'm just saying there is a possibility for severe cases for them to be dangerous, so it's always just safe to go get yourself checked out. Since I have gone over psychosis early in the video, I feel like you can better understand the schizo disorders now. There are quite a few, but I'm going to be going over schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, as they seem to be the most life-threatening schizo disorders. The word schizo itself derives from the ancient Greek word schizon, meaning to divide, which fits because when you have one of these disorders, it almost feels like you are separated from reality. Symptoms of schizophrenia include the mentioned psychosis episodes, which consists of auditory and visual hallucinations. People with schizophrenia also experience the inability to hold organized thinking and can be unpredictable and sometimes irrational. Not to mention presenting a lack of typical behaviors such as reduced speaking, social withdrawal, unresponsiveness, and sometimes even a lack of emotions. And while schizophrenia is referred to as the cancer of mental illness, that doesn't mean there isn't hope for treatment when you have it. Similar to many disorders, medications have been specifically developed to help with this condition. The trick is just finding the one that works. The other disorder I mentioned, schizoaffective disorder, is essentially a worse version of schizophrenia because alongside the symptoms I've already mentioned, schizoaffective disorder has intense depressive and manic episodes, similar to the bipolar disorder that was mentioned earlier. Schizophrenia is often diagnosed in your late teens or early 20s, but it can be diagnosed at any point during your life. But I wouldn't worry because it only affects 1% or less of Americans. But as I mentioned, it isn't called the cancer of mental illness for nothing. And in severe cases, it completely consumes your life. And often treatment is required to increase the chances of making it through that time. Up until now, we've been mostly covering disorders, but this one feels almost like a mental deterioration. Falling back to 1901, Dr. Alois Alzheimer was studying a patient who went by August Detter. She initially came in with a memory impairment and some difficulty understanding people speaking her same language. Following this, she was admitted to a mental hospital where things began to get worse. Over time, the disorientation would turn into hallucinations, unpredictable behavior, and almost amnesia levels of memory loss. This was understandably very alarming. Unfortunately, there wasn't much he could do for her at that time, and 5 years later, she would pass away from the illness. Post-mortem, she would have an autopsy done in her brain in order to figure out what went wrong, and proteins were found to be growing inside of the brain that eventually led to her death. This would come to be known as dementia, or to be more specific, Alzheimer's. And to be honest, it's one of the most devastating conditions for both you and the people around you. A couple weeks ago, I was asking myself whether I'd rather have a loved one get dementia, or rather I'd get dementia myself, and I honestly could not answer the question because both would be a complete nightmare scenario. It has come to the point where it definitely is one of my worst fears and fears of many people across the globe. When diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you slowly deteriorate until nothing is left. Typically, Alzheimer's happens to patients over 65, but cases known as early onset dementia have appeared much earlier, such as in your 40s and even 30s. While this is scary, there is still hope. While there is technically no cure, there are treatments that are actively being improved as we speak. Cognitive stimulation, as well as a specific diet and active exercise, can also be helpful for slowing the process down. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's affects nearly 6.7 million Americans, and there is about a 10% chance you will develop some form of it as you get older. But thankfully, it is unlikely until you get into the back half of your life, increasing to about 32% once you get into your late 80s. Alzheimer's, unfortunately, is eventually fatal, but it can be slow to take multiple years to take full effect. Regardless, it is a terrifying aspect. The time is 1880, and French neurologist Jules Cotard has come across a particularly unique and unexplainable illness. His patient, Mademoiselle, is claiming that she isn't alive, despite walking in and obviously being the contrary. She had extremely pessimistic delusions, and she believed that not only was she no longer alive and therefore being a walking corpse, that she had her organs stolen from her, including her nerves, brain, heart, intestines, etc., and that the woman standing before the psychologist was a shell of a person. This would only get worse as she refused to eat, as she believed there was no need, and she saw herself as almost being immortal. This baffling mentality would later be known as Cotard's syndrome, also commonly referred to as walking corpse syndrome. Walking corpse syndrome is a mental illness that causes living people to believe that they are dead or have been dead for a long time. They feel empty and often detached from their bodies. This surreal condition, as mentioned before, may also make someone feel like their internal organs are completely gone and that they are missing something inside of them. Since they don't feel alive, they are subject to feeling incredibly sad, as well as not seeing a point in everyday tasks or relationships, causing isolation in severe cases. It is unclear what causes this, but it is thought to be strokes or other forms of brain injury. It can also be a sort of side symptom of some of the other things I'll be talking about today. It is also known to be caused by some drugs that alter your perception. One of the more disturbing parts of this syndrome is the fact that when you see yourself as not being alive, and not needing to take care of yourself in any way, shape, or form, I shouldn't have to explain the fact on why that is a dangerous mindset that should be kept a close eye on. Mademoiselle unfortunately would pass away due to malnutrition later on, but over 140 years has passed since this event, and since this condition is not what you would call easy to treat, it doesn't mean that all hope is lost, as there have been medications that have proved successful. Walking corpse syndrome affects such a low amount of people that a percentage can't be made, but I would estimate less than 0.01% of people, making it the rarest disorder on our list. Now, between the self-neglect and the distress that does come with this disorder, on top of the fact that it tends to come with depression, gives it a very high toll on the people who are diagnosed with it. Coincidentally, walking corpse syndrome was not the only disorder to be first diagnosed in 1880. While born in 1863, at the age of 17, Louis Vivet would have a traumatic incident involving becoming completely paralyzed while encountering a snake. After recovering, he was found to have been shattered into 10 different versions of himself, each with distinct traits, memories, and physical symptoms. For example, one gained the ability to walk while the other had to stay stationary after being paralyzed. Various psychiatrists studied him, and although confused with schizophrenia initially, they diagnosed him as the first known case of dissociative identity disorder, also known as multiple personality disorder. DID is one of the more confusing disorders that I had to go over in this video, and one that I don't really know a lot about personally, so a lot of this information is coming from the internet, so do with that what you will. It is said that despite popular belief, rather than having one personality and then adding a ton of others on top of it, instead it takes your one original personality, splitting it off into a bunch of different versions of yourself that all come out at different times, with each one having different processes and interests. Now, it is unknown to me whether they would sort of just all learn the same things, or if whoever was in control, maybe at work, they would learn more skills, or same thing with school, or if only one of the personalities met somebody, if the other personalities would not remember them entirely. And So there's just a lot of gray area when it comes to DID. Another source that I read stated that DID comes in the form of episodes that seem to be alter egos that are used to cope with trauma. I think Sunny from the indie game Omori is a good example, as he experiences severe trauma and then splits into two personalities, Sunny and Omori. Sunny, which is more like a calm, shy version of himself, and Omori, who is a silent but aggressive alter ego that you only play in his dreamscapes. Regardless, I'm not here to talk about Omori. I have like 2 videos on it. It's an amazing horror game. I think you should check it out. But while DID is extremely hard to treat, often hypnosis and extensive therapy can eventually make the dissociative episodes less often and sort of work on slowly combining them into one personality again. DID affects less than 1% of the US population, making it a rare diagnosis. DID causes memory gaps, identity confusion, and since each experience is different, and there are technically no limits on how many personalities there can be, it can cause severe disruption in day-to-day life. Now, another symptom that I found uniquely horrifying was a version of amnesia. If you're unfamiliar with what amnesia is, it's essentially where you forget who you were or where you've been or the people you've met, resulting from some sort of either injury or some disruption in your brain. But the version I found seems to be way more severe than that. Henry Molaison, or HM, was a patient in 1953 who was trying to get treatment for his epilepsy. However, after he woke up from the surgery, he developed the cruel case of anterograde amnesia, which essentially works in the opposite way of normal amnesia. Your brain becomes incapable of creating new memories past what is immediately going on in front of you, and once things happen or once something is taught to you, you will forget it entirely very soon after. So in case you don't quite grip how severe this is, you would almost be stuck in that same moment forever. Like, you remember what happened before that time, but every single time something new happens, it's just like a momentary couple minutes, and after you're done learning it, you kind of just get reset back to that same point over and over again. And that seems to me like it would be incredibly hard to deal with and would put your life completely on pause. However, most people who do suffer from this get around it by using reminders such as memory aids, like writing down key events that happen in notebooks or on their phones, or having someone remind you of things that happened. There have been attempts to treat the underlying cause of this, which most of the time happens to be deficiencies and brain conditions. To me, this is one of the scariest conditions due to its lasting effects. However, the chances of experiencing this symptom are incredibly rare and less than 0.1%, falling under one of our more rare symptoms. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the books or movie of Alice in Wonderland, it is essentially a story about a girl who falls down the rabbit hole and ends up in a strange land where nothing is as it seems. It's an interesting scenario and an absolute classic when it comes to surreal culture, but that's for another time. However, back in 1955, after Lewis Carroll released the first iteration, a neurologist would speak up, claiming that he actually had patients reporting frequent instances of the same misconceptions of reality described in the pieces. People were describing things way bigger than they actually were, and reality seemed to be completely out of whack for them. It was here that the very first instances of Alice in Wonderland syndrome were officially studied and made an official disorder. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is triggered very similar to psychosis in the fact that it's in episodes. However, it is often brought on by migraines or other sudden ailments such as epilepsy, and has even been known being caused by stress and anxiety. Symptoms include perceiving objects around you as way bigger or way smaller than they actually are, known as micropsia and macropsia respectively, as well as not being able to comprehend the sort of time around you and it's slowing down or speeding up. If this doesn't make a lot of sense, picture just watching TV, then out of nowhere you begin to suddenly feel off. Your hands look almost like a toy and the items around you shift and tower over you. You're there for what feels like hours, when in reality it was only like 10 minutes. And that's if you're lucky, as some episodes similar to psychosis can last much, much longer. So who knows how long it'll feel like to you due to the time distortion. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is only seen to be curable via stopping its root cause. For example, if it is onset by migraines, taking anti-migraine medicine to stop those would in turn stop the disorder from happening. But regardless, it is a very unpredictable condition that makes it that much more scary for people diagnosed with it. But if one of these things were to happen to you, just use the same methods we mentioned earlier about psychosis, and it should work just as well. Alice in Wonderland syndrome, while being more common in children, is another disorder that is below a 0.1 chance of experiencing it in your lifetime. And when you do experience it, it lasts only as long as headaches, making it more of a temporary condition, but still not one to be taken lightly. Now, after discussing the walking corpse syndrome from earlier, it is not very surprising that there is another disorder that instead causes you to believe that one of your body parts, be it your arm or your leg or another one of your limbs, do not belong to you, and immediately wishing to have it removed. This would be discovered when a man would walk into a clinic with the strange request of cutting off a healthy limb. And despite further research, it would be confirmed that this was indeed the case. Typically, when using the term body dysphoria, it is a term used when one does not like their body or outward appearance, but it usually never goes as far as serious injury, such as amputation. This is when the disorder falls under body integrity dysphoria. It sometimes gets even more disturbing, as people often fantasize about being disabled or being an amputee, as is the case with the man I referred to earlier. He believed that he was always meant to be without a leg, and he wouldn't be happy until the amputation was performed. Now, when it comes to treating this disorder, it's kind of a gray area, because some people think that it should be done via extensive therapy, while others believe that it is within their right to either get their limbs professionally amputated or, in worst cases, taking the dangerous risk of doing it themselves. Now, despite me not being able to find any more serious cases of this, I'm curious as to if there's ever been any cases where people wanted to amputate more than one of their limbs, and if amputating one of them brings initial relief, but then episodes can come back forcing you to want to cut off another one of your limbs, or if it's just one. Regardless, there's a lot of controversy surrounding this disorder, as it's debatable whether doctors should even be cutting off people's limbs, as it does permanently affect how they function in society going forward. But honestly, I don't think it's my place to have an opinion on this, so I'm just going to leave it up to you guys to tell me what you think. Body integrity dysphoria follows the same trend as the other disorders of this section, affecting an extremely small portion of the population, despite its relative disorders affecting much more. Body integrity dysphoria, however, is considered heavily life-altering, as it can lead to serious permanent amputations that can inhibit someone from performing day-to-day tasks. That'll be it for this video. I hope you guys found it entertaining, and I'm sorry if I left some disorders out. I just chose the ones that meant the most to me and the ones that I think needed more attention. I have a lot of ideas for future videos, and I'm very excited to bring them to you guys, so if you're excited to see that, make sure to consider subscribing to the channel, as I try to make the best horror content I can, and it means a lot to me.